The world of cosplay is built on transformation, on the idea that a person can step into a fictional character so completely that the boundary between real life and performance begins to blur. For Melissa Turner, that blurring eventually took a darker form than anyone in her community had anticipated. She was known as someone who attended conventions, built elaborate costumes, and maintained a warm, playful online persona rooted in anime and fantasy. On social media, she presented a colorful, creative life. In October 2019, the story behind that persona collapsed in the most permanent way possible. Melissa lived in Florida with her boyfriend, 25-year-old Matthew Trussler. By most external measures, they appeared to be a fairly unremarkable young couple trying to find their way, and neighbors and acquaintances would later describe their relationship as one that seemed, from a distance, like any other. But prosecutors would argue that behind closed doors, the dynamic was under serious strain, volatile, and increasingly dangerous. In the early morning hours of October 18, 2019, something escalated between them. By the time it was over, Matthew Trussler was dead from stab wounds. When officers arrived, Melissa told them she had acted in self-defense. She claimed that Matthew had been abusive throughout their relationship, and that on that night, fearing for her own life, she had responded in the only way she believed was available to her. That claim would become the central argument of her defense when the case went to trial nearly 2.5 years later. But the physical evidence, according to investigators, told a more complicated story. Detectives raised questions about the nature and pattern of the injuries and how they aligned with the sequence of events as Melissa had described them. They noted inconsistencies between her account and what the forensic evidence suggested about how the confrontation had unfolded. The prosecution argued that Melissa had not acted in a moment of genuine fear, but had attacked Matthew in anger, and that the evidence reflected that distinction clearly. The case went to trial in February 2022. It drew consistent local coverage in Tampa, partly because of the underlying violence and partly because of the contrast the case presented. A self-described cosplay princess, now facing a murder charge in a Florida courtroom. Reporters noted the distance between the image she had carefully constructed online and the circumstances she was now confronting. The defense worked to maintain the portrait of Melissa as a victim, someone who had endured repeated abuse and finally broke under its weight, on a night she had not chosen and could not escape. They argued that the jury had to consider the full history of the relationship, not only the final night. The prosecution offered a different portrait, a woman capable of volatility, one who had crossed a line that had nothing to do with survival instinct. They pointed to the contradictions in her statements and to the forensic findings as the foundation of that argument. After deliberation, the jury sided with the prosecution. Melissa Turner was convicted of second-degree murder. Sentencing came in March 2022. Melissa was 29 years old when the judge handed down a term of 20.5 years in prison. Prosecutors had sought as much as 35 years, but even at 20.5, the arithmetic was stark. She would be in her late 40s before becoming eligible for release. Matthew Trussler's mother addressed the court before the sentence was delivered. She spoke about the damage she felt Melissa's self-defense narrative had caused. A second injury, in her words, layered on top of the first. The case drew continued attention after the verdict, particularly in true crime media. The contrast that had defined coverage from the start, the costumed convention-attending public identity set against the violence of that October night, remained the lens through which most audiences encountered the story. It raised a question that surfaces repeatedly in cases like this. How much does a carefully maintained public persona conceal from the people closest to someone? How much does it conceal, in the end, even from the person maintaining it? Today, Melissa Turner is serving her sentence in a Florida correctional facility. She was one of countless people who used social media to project an aspirational, carefully framed version of their lives. What distinguished her case was not simply the gap between image and reality. That gap is universal. It was how completely and permanently her own reality eventually overtook everything she had built. She dressed in designer labels. She stayed in suites at New York City's most prestigious hotels. She moved through the city's upper social world with the quiet ease of someone who had never once questioned whether she belonged anywhere she entered. For roughly 2 years, she circulated as Anna Delvey, the name she had chosen, a young German heiress with serious ambitions to open a private arts club in Manhattan. Bankers considered her loan applications. Hotels extended her credit. Friends traveled with her and covered expenses on the understanding that she would settle up later. What none of them knew was that Anna Delvey did not exist. Her real name was Anna Sorokin. She had been born in Russia had grown up partly in Germany, and had arrived in New York without an inheritance, without family money, and without the background she claimed. What she did bring was an exceptionally precise understanding of how aspiration works. Specifically, how in New York's high social world, confidence performs the same function as wealth. The right clothes, the right rooms, the right tone of mild impatience at anything less than the best. She built that performance carefully, and for 2 full years, it held. Between 2016 and 2017, Sorokin engaged in a series of fraudulent schemes that sustained her lifestyle without the resources to legitimately support it. She departed from hotels without settling bills that sometimes ran to tens of thousands of dollars. She submitted falsified financial documentation when applying for substantial loans. She persuaded people around her, friends who trusted her, town associates who believed in her projects, and to cover costs she had no intention of repaying. One of the most widely reported examples was a trip to Morocco that left a close friend with a bill of more than $60,000. At one point, Sorokin came alarmingly close to securing a $25 million loan from a city national bank for her proposed arts club, submitting paperwork that held up longer than it had any right to. The unraveling, when it came, followed the pattern of most financial frauds: small cracks, then larger ones, then a cascade of questions that the fabricated paperwork could not survive. Hotels that had once welcomed her stopped accepting her reservations. Investors who had been in discussions about her club began asking harder questions. By 2018, investigators had assembled enough of a picture to act. Sorokin was arrested and charged with multiple counts of grand larceny and theft of services. According to prosecutors, the value of what she had taken or deceived others into providing exceeded $200,000. Her trial in New York in 2019 became one of the more unusual public spectacles the city had seen in years. The proceedings drew significant press attention, partly because the story was genuinely extraordinary, partly because of who Sorokin appeared to be in the courtroom: composed, stylishly dressed in outfits her attorney had arranged, apparently unshaken by the weight of what she was facing. The defense argued she was an ambitious young woman who had overextended herself in pursuit of a legitimate goal, and whose ambition should be understood in the context of a city that practically demanded it. The prosecution described her as a deliberate and practiced deceiver who had exploited people's desire to believe in her. In April 2019, the jury convicted her on multiple counts. The judge, who expressed exasperation at the extent of her deceptions, sentenced her to 4 to 12 years in prison and ordered her to pay restitution and fines totaling close to $200,000. She served just under 4 years before being released on good behavior credit in February 2021, only to be immediately detained by federal immigration authorities for overstaying her visa. Even from a detention facility, her name continued to circulate as a cultural reference point. A long-form profile in New York Magazine had already transformed her into a phenomenon before the trial concluded. Netflix adapted her story into a limited series, or Inventing Anna, which reached millions of viewers and reignited public debate about what her case actually meant. Was she a criminal, a symptom, or a mirror reflecting a city's own obsession with inherited wealth and access? The argument goes on. Her victims, of course, had a clearer answer. What the case revealed, beyond the specifics of the fraud, was something about the systems she had exploited. Her deceptions worked because the world she moved through was already predisposed to believe them. She did not break into anything. She simply became someone, completely and convincingly, and let the performance carry her the rest of the way. Thanksgiving is supposed to be the most ordinary of American holidays. Turkey, family, the smell of cooking filling an apartment. In Costa Mesa, California, on November 28, 1991, those ordinary sounds and smells were present in the Nelson household too. But what happened inside that apartment on Thanksgiving Day was anything but ordinary. And when police finally pieced together the full picture, even veteran investigators struggled to process what they were looking at. Omaima Nelson was 23 years old, Egyptian-born, and by all visible measures, someone trying to build a new life in America. She had worked as a model and a nanny. People who knew her described her as strikingly beautiful, charming, and determined to succeed. She had arrived in the United States a few years earlier and had, at least from the outside, been making her way through the world on the strength of charm and ambition. Then she met William Nelson. Bill Nelson was 56, a pilot and real estate investor, twice divorced. He and Omaima married after knowing each other for less than 2 months. It was the kind of whirlwind romance that friends quietly worried about from the beginning. The age gap was one thing, the pace was another. The arguments that followed, frequent, escalating, witnessed by people around them, signaled that this marriage was not going to settle gently into stability. What exactly happened on Thanksgiving night remains, in some details, contested. According to prosecutors, Omaima killed her husband inside their Costa Mesa apartment. What came next was the element that made the case nationally infamous. Based on the evidence presented at trial, she proceeded to dismember his body and, in a detail that disturbed even those experienced in violent crime, cooked and consumed parts of him. Omaima later claimed she had been in a state of psychological crisis, that Bill had abused her throughout their relationship, and that she had acted in a moment of desperate self-preservation. She said she had no clear memory of what followed. Investigators did not find those explanations convincing. What they saw in the evidence was not a chaotic, dissociative act, but a prolonged and deliberate attempt to eliminate proof of what had occurred. The case broke open not through forensic detection, but through a phone call. Omaima appeared at a friend's home carrying garbage bags and asked for help disposing of what was inside. The friend, alarmed, contacted police. Officers entered the Nelson apartment and found a scene that would stay with them for years. Detectives describing the case in terms borrowed from horror fiction were not being dramatic for the cameras. Prosecutors in front of the jury invoked the name of the fictional Hannibal Lecter to convey to a civilian audience the nature of what had been discovered. Language rarely used in courtrooms, but considered fitting given what the evidence showed. The trial began in 1992. Omaima's defense built its case around the claim that she was a battered woman who had endured sustained abuse at Bill's hands. Her attorneys argued that the events of Thanksgiving night, however extreme, were the product of trauma, fear, and psychological collapse, not calculation. The prosecution countered systematically. They acknowledged that abuse allegations were possible, but argued that her conduct following the death could not be explained by self-defense or mental crisis alone. What followed the killing, they said, reflected deliberate decision-making. In January 1993, a California jury convicted Omaima Nelson of second-degree murder. The verdict rejected her self-defense argument, but stopped short of a first-degree conviction. She was sentenced to 27 years, to life in prison. Parole hearings came and went. In 2006, then again in 2011, and at each one, the board denied release. Officials cited the severity of her actions and what they described as an absence of genuine remorse. Reports from those hearings described her as composed in ways that gave the board little confidence she had fully confronted what she had done. She remained incarcerated in California. Documentaries, books, and investigative programs have returned to her story repeatedly over the decades, drawn not only to the crime itself but to the contradiction at its center. A young woman who had embodied, at least on the surface, aspiration and reinvention became permanently associated with one of the most disturbing domestic cases in Orange County's history. Her story endures because it refuses to resolve. It offers no clean explanation, only the jagged reality of a marriage that ended in ways most people still find almost impossible to comprehend. She had spent years building an image that felt both aspirational and attainable, the kind of life that social media was designed to make you want. Cat Torres, born Catucia Torres Soares in Brazil, had begun modeling as a teenager, working her way through São Paulo's competitive fashion world before establishing a presence on international runways. On Instagram, she projected the life of someone who had made it. Luxury travel, designer fashion, motivational captions, a polished aesthetic built for maximum impact. Hundreds of thousands of followers watched, admired, and believed. Then, in 2024, Brazilian prosecutors revealed what had been happening behind the posts. According to investigators, Torres had been using her modeling credentials and social media reach as the operational foundation of a human trafficking scheme. Young women, many of them aspiring models themselves, had been approached with what appeared to be legitimate opportunities. Contracts, international exposure, access to the kind of fashion industry connections that a well-established figure like Torres seemed ideally placed to offer. According to prosecutors, none of those promises were real. The women who accepted them reportedly found themselves in exploitative arrangements involving forced labor and sexual exploitation, stripped of the freedom and opportunity they had been told they were gaining. Authorities accused Torres of using false contracts to bind her victims, controlling their movements, and profiting from their exploitation. The psychological dimension of the case, the way that trust in her public image had functioned as the actual mechanism of the crime, was central to what made it so troubling. She was not a stranger to these women. She was someone they had made a deliberate choice to believe in, a person whose platform seemed to validate the industry they were trying to enter. That trust, prosecutors alleged, was precisely the lever she had used. Torres was arrested in July 2024. Police took her into custody in Belo Horizonte, though her career had moved for years between Rio de Janeiro and various international fashion hubs. Raids connected to the investigation uncovered documents and testimony linking her to multiple victims, each of whom described patterns of deception that prosecutors argued were systematic and deliberate, not isolated or accidental events. Brazilian media framed the case as one of the highest-profile human trafficking prosecutions the country had seen in years, elevated further by the fact that the accused was someone with a genuine public presence. The trial generated considerable national attention and some international coverage. Prosecutors outlined in detail how Torres had leveraged her verified social media credibility and industry standing to gain access to women who had limited reason to doubt her. The argument was direct. The image itself had been the instrument of the crime. Torres maintained throughout the proceedings that the accusations were false and that she was being deliberately misrepresented. Her defense characterized the testimony against her as unreliable and motivated. The court was not persuaded. In late 2024, a Brazilian court convicted Cat Torres of human trafficking and of placing women into conditions analogous to slavery. The judge sentenced her to 8 years in prison. Prosecutors described the ruling as meaningful beyond the individual case, a signal, they said, that using public credibility and platform reach as tools to exploit vulnerable people would not insulate anyone from accountability. The response across social media was immediate and divided. Many of Torres's former followers expressed genuine disbelief. The contrast between her carefully maintained online presence and the verdict was, for people who had followed her for years, difficult to reconcile. Brazilian tabloids ran her modeling photographs alongside her arrest photos. International outlets picked up the story under the label it had been assigned by the time the verdict arrived: the model trafficker. Her Instagram account remains visible, its posts frozen at a point before the investigation went public. The beaches, the hotels, the designer items, the aspirational captions, all still there. To look at them now, knowing what prosecutors argued was happening behind that surface, is to understand something specific about the distance between the life someone presents and the life they actually lead. For the women whose trust she allegedly exploited, the conviction was a form of justice long delayed. For the broader public, her story stands as one of the clearest recent examples of how a curated image, when stripped away, can reveal something entirely unrecognizable beneath it. In the middle of a Walmart parking lot in Ohio, on an unremarkable afternoon in 2015, Tara Lambert sat across from a man she believed was a professional killer. She had arranged the meeting herself. She had a specific target in mind, specific methods of disposal she was prepared to discuss, and a cash payment she had brought with her. By the time she left that parking lot, every word she had spoken was on tape, because the man she was meeting had never been a hitman. He was an undercover police officer. Tara Lambert was a former fashion model from small-town Ohio. She had done modeling work in her younger years and had maintained the composed, image-conscious manner of someone accustomed to presenting herself carefully for an audience. She had a husband, stepchildren, and what appeared from the outside to be a conventional suburban life. The life she was actually living, according to prosecutors, had become increasingly consumed by resentment. The source of that resentment was her husband's ex-wife, the biological mother of her stepchildren, whose continued presence in the family's life Tara had come to view not merely as an inconvenience, but as a problem to be solved permanently. According to court testimony, the plan she outlined to the undercover officer was specific. She wanted the woman dead. She wanted the body handled afterward. Testimony revealed that she had even proposed a particular method of disposal, a detail so precise and so cold that it became one of the defining images of the case in press coverage. She handed over an initial payment at the meeting. She believed she was setting a genuine operation in motion. She did not know she was narrating her own arrest in real time. When police moved to take her into custody, the case they had assembled was unusually complete. In most conspiracy prosecutions, intent must be reconstructed through circumstantial evidence and inference. Here, jurors who sat through the trial heard Tara Lambert in her own voice, describing in specific terms what she wanted done and to whom. The defense attempted to argue that she had been mentally unstable and operating under pressure that compromised her judgment, that what happened in that parking lot did not reflect a fully formed criminal intent, but rather a moment of crisis. The recordings made that position extremely difficult to maintain. In January 2016, a jury in Ohio convicted Tara Lambert of conspiracy to commit aggravated murder. The image that stayed with many observers from that day was specific. She stood in the courtroom in a jail-issued jumpsuit, having been denied her pre-trial request to appear in civilian clothes and makeup for the reading of the verdict. The judge who denied that request understood, at least implicitly, what such an image would communicate. Whatever version of herself Tara Lambert had spent years carefully maintaining, that chapter had closed. In February 2016, she was sentenced to 7 years in prison. The legal story did not resolve cleanly. Her first conviction was later overturned on a technical flaw in the indictment. Not a reassessment of the evidence, but a procedural issue that required the case to be retried from the beginning. Prosecutors moved quickly. In 2017, a second jury heard the same evidence and returned the same verdict. She was convicted again and handed an identical sentence. The system had no ambiguity about what the evidence showed. The intended victim, the woman Tara had paid to have killed, had escaped entirely because law enforcement had intervened before any physical harm could occur. She spoke in court before sentencing and used a single word to describe Tara: a demon. For someone who had learned that another person had spent time and money on the deliberate planning of her death, the word required no elaboration. She had not been physically harmed, but she had been forced to understand that someone she existed near had coldly tried to remove her from the world. Public reaction to the case was substantial. The image that media coverage repeatedly returned to, a former fashion model arranging a murder in a Walmart parking lot, was the kind of contrast that made national outlets stop and stare. It had the quality of something too specific to be invented. Tara Lambert served her sentence in Ohio and was eventually released after completing her term. But the case continues to be cited in true crime discussions, in examinations of domestic conflict dynamics, in studies of how resentment and jealousy, when they cross certain thresholds, do not simply produce arguments, they produce plans. 5 women, 5 carefully built images of beauty, success, aspiration, and a life worth admiring. In each case, those images were not entirely false, but they were incomplete, and the distance between what was shown and what was real proved to be where everything went wrong. Omaima Nelson built a new life in America and destroyed it on a single holiday. Melissa Turner curated a world of fantasy and color while concealing a reality that ended in a Florida courtroom. Anna Sorokin constructed an identity so convincing that New York's financial and social institutions could not see through it until the damage was done. Tara Lambert maintained the image of suburban grace while privately planning something no amount of composure could make ordinary. Cat Torres turned aspiration itself into a weapon and used it against the people who trusted her most. What these 5 cases share is not background or crime type. It is the gap, the deliberate, sustained distance between what was shown and what was real. In most of these cases, that gap was not incidental. It was the strategy. We live in a world built around curated surfaces. These cases are a reminder that surfaces deserve scrutiny, and that the people most skilled at maintaining them are not always the people they appear to be. If this video stayed with you, hit subscribe, leave a like, and join the conversation below. Here is the question worth asking. Out of these 5 women, whose story do you find hardest to understand? And what do you think was truly driving her?